Okay, everyone. Welcome to my second attempt to make a history lecture, the kind you will receive in the classroom, based on one of my PowerPoints. This one's a popular one. It's world history. We're going to do world history today, leading up to the American experience in World War One. But it makes no sense to discuss the American experience in World War One if I've said it in class time and time again. If we don't have the context of what was happening before the United States would be drawn into this global event. So World War One, that's what it was called after the fact. Very good reason why it's called World War One, although there's a lot of there's disagreements. Various historians, was it really the First World War, Napoleon's Wars, perhaps the First World Wars? Okay, but it's a world war because what makes it different is the scope. The scope was global. This is the first time. Again, this has been debated. This is the first time in which we see a major conflict play out between belligerent players that are positioned in various points, various places throughout the world, with interests throughout the world. Hence, this conflict takes on a global scope, if you will. They didn't call it World War One at the time. It's kind of like you need a point of reference. That calling it World War One only really came into vogue the next World War. At the time, it was referred to as the Great War, and it really was. It was the world had never seen something like this before. Not this kind of destruction and murder at this kind of scope. Never before. What happens when you take industrialization, mass production of the modern day industrialization is capable of, and then mesh it with warfare, and well, you get the mass production of death. Okay, that's exactly what happened. Um, when they called it the Great War, they weren't exaggerating. The world had never seen a conflict that produced death and destruction at this magnitude, never before in human history. Um, Very much is, and against this is debatable. Was it the first war of the industrial era? It was the first industrial war, the first war in which all of the potential and capacity of the industrialized nations of the world were directed towards war, this conflict, with pretty horrendous consequences. So World War One, the Great War. Let's give you some context. So pretty much all historians that have studied World War One pretty much look at four things as the causes behind this war. Others like to scramble them around, have a cute little acronym called MAIN. The order I'm putting them here is pretty deliberate. It's pretty deliberate. As in one thing led to another. Okay. Imperialism, militarism, nationalism, and my face is kind of covering it here. Alliances, secret alliances. All four of these things were, the toxic ingredients, if you will, that led to this incredibly destructive global war at the beginning of the 20th century, or the beginning of the 20th century. Let's talk about imperialism for a second. Maybe remember this map. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, and we talked about this, the new imperialism, colonialism, driven by what? The need to seek out and possess resources, the need to control labor in faraway places for the purpose of extracting these resources, the need to have markets by which to sell surplus goods to. All of these things came, these were the economic motivations behind this new period in which pretty much Europe, industrialized nations of the world, made it a point to go out there to the underdeveloped parts of the world and plant their flag. And in one way or another, I mean, we're highly condensing this. Take possession of resources. Take possession of resources. Take command of local populations for the purpose of cheap labor to extract these resources. And make it so these places at the same time opened up their markets to a flood of surplus goods coming from Europe. This was an economic system that was designed to benefit and enrich the industrialized nations of the world while basically impoverishing the other places, the places on the periphery, the places whose resources were being taken and whose local population was being put to work to extract these resources and whose markets were being blown wide open for. So I want you to look at that map. And as the end of the 19th century played out, and there's plenty of room in the world, if you will, to go out there and stake your claim. If you're, at some point it runs out. At some point, there's nothing else. There's nothing else to take. Everything, and the Americas are a separate phenomenon. Talk about neo-colonialism, that's a different context. But what happens when everything is spoken for? Everything has already been taken by one power or the other. But your factories still need more resources, cheaper resources. You're still producing surplus goods, and you're still in a desperate need to open up new markets for these. If there's no low-hanging fruit anymore, then it's just a question of time. Inevitably, the next expansion is going to be at your neighbor's doorstep. It's going to be not some people in sub-Saharan Africa or in Southeast Asia that don't have the ability to defend themselves. It's going to be a rival. It's going to be a rival's colonies, and this sets the stage for conflict. Okay, it's driven by capitalism. Imperialism in the late 19th century was driven by profit, driven by capitalism. Capitalism's need to continue to profit. Okay. And here we have a situation, a highly competitive situation, in which conflict between rival industrial powers is not an issue of if, but when, because there are no more low-hanging fruit, but yet the needs of a modern industrial capitalist society are still there. They are not going to disappear. They're going to intensify with time. And then going back to the old slide, well, the one that was before, I guess it's not going to let me go back. Militarism. If the stage is set for some sort of an inevitable conflict between rival industrial powers, well, how do you think they're going to go about preparing for this eventual conflict? Hence the emergence of militarism throughout Europe and the emergence of an arms race. Okay, goes all the way back to the 1890s when the German Empire embraces an aggressive foreign policy and pretty much sets itself on the path of, at the time, the largest navy in the world was Great Britain, 3 times the size of the next largest navy. The German government, the German Empire, made it a point that they were going to challenge Great Britain for prominence in the world's oceans, and they begin to aggressively expand Remember, this is, late 19th, early 20th century. The United States got caught up in this fever too. This is Alfred Mahan, the influence on sea power. He's saying great powers need great navies. Great extended powers who have extended their influence and their presence across the surface of the globe need great large navies in order to enforce and preserve their position on the planet. Okay, so it's not a secret. Germany embarks on an aggressive foreign policy of building up its navy to compete with the British. This starts in the late 1890s. Okay, by 1906, the Germans develop a new type of the dreadnought, and that only makes the situation even worse. And it's not just the Germans and the British who have ended up into this arms race. The Russians and the Ottoman Turks are caught up in an arms race. The French and the Italians are caught up in an arms race, and the United States and the Japanese are caught up in an arms race. So there's your militarism. Imperialism leads to a competitive international global environment between rival industrial countries, okay, with an eventual conflict being an issue of not if but when they begin to prepare themselves by embarking into an arms race. And then you have the topic of nationalism, and that's one that a lot of people don't quite know where to start to put your thumb on it. I mean, is there a difference between patriotism and nationalism? And in the spirit of not making this a long, protracted discussion, we're going to say that patriotism is love of one's country, whether your country is a great country or not, or a small country. It's love of one's country the same way you love one's family, is because that this is who we are, this is where we're from, etc., etc. We don't have to be the best, we don't have to be the biggest, we don't have. Nationalism is when you start, it starts to take it too far. Okay, it goes beyond loving one's country, but it begins to flirt with a much more aggressive, hostile posture. My country's the best. My country's better than the rest, and that just lays down the groundwork for rivalry, competitiveness, and eventual conflict. Not only is my country the best, there's only room in this planet for my country and not anybody else's. I mean, that would be an extreme form of nationalism. I mean, yes, we could have a more rounded out discussion about this, absolutely. And and understand the nation state is not that old in human history. The idea of holding some sort of an allegiance or loyalty to this construct, the nation, right? It's like, and because we were born within these defined borders that we artificially made up on this earth, and we all speak the same language, and it's much easier to put your thumb on nationalism when you're talking about a homogeneous society, like Japanese nationalism. Like, what does it mean to them? Well, everybody pretty much has a common ancestry, a common descent, common language, common historical experience, etc., etc. Even the Europe of the early 20th century, when it was a lot less diverse societies, yeah, you could put your thumb down as like the sense of French nationalism, and or British nationalism, or German nationalism, especially. When you start getting into the complexities of diversity, countries had a significant immigrant experience, then how you define nationalism gets a little tricky. Okay, what is the glue that holds the nation together and that I'm supposed to be loyal towards? Okay, is it a common language, historical experience, faith? All of these things have been used in the past to give definition to what makes a nation a nation. And what does it say? In the early 20s, there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of peacocks walking around the world, strutting their stuff, believing that they're better than everybody else. Look at the map, of course. This country, look what this country's been able to accomplish and what this country's been able to accomplish. But the nationalism bug is not just, big countries. Small countries feel it too. Okay? Small countries that would like to stay independent or are not independent at the moment, but would want to be independent countries one day as well. So that, nationalism is not solely the domain of big, powerful, major countries. It's also, smaller countries, nationless states also were pretty much caught that fever, if you will. Yeah. So we talked about imperialism. Unfortunately, I left that slide. So imperialism, militarism, nationalism, the world coalescing around competing nationalities, competing nation states. What are they competing for? Dominance on the world stage. But there's also smaller nations that want a seat at the table as well. And the lastly is secret alliances. And I don't imagine anybody watches the show Survivor anymore. If the political situation in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century is incredibly tense, Europe is a continent that, I'm not exaggerating, for centuries it was known for war. Okay, almost constant warfare between the various, nation states, shifting nationalities, etc., throughout Europe. I mean, a long history of war on the continent. 19th century kind of introduces a break from that, only because Europe was expending much of that energy instead of towards one another, towards colonizing much of the world. But once that process is done and over with, it comes back. It comes back to, I imagine there could be some disagreement with what I'm saying, because it does sound kind of like deterministic. If you know that conflict, because of the increasing competitive nature of the geopolitical reality that was created in Europe at the end of the 19th century, capitalist industrial societies growing ever more competitive with one another, ever more rivalrous with one another, they're preparing for an inevitable conflict. They're building up weapons, etc., and building up their armies, building up their navies. It would be stupid not to position yourself in the best possible place for when that conflict emerges. Hence, you have alliances. Like we have alliances today. NATO's an alliance, for example. But these alliances were secret alliances. That's what made them all the more dangerous. If country A enters into a deal with country B, that if country C starts something, country B is going to come to country A's aid. But here the problem, country C has no idea. And we had a number of these secret alliances that when when the buttons are pressed, then all the dominoes start to fall into place. Sorry about these crazy analogies. What could have been a contained minor conflict blows up into a full-scale global one. One of the shocking things about World War I is how quickly the world went from tense but relatively at peace to all out hell on earth, like in a month, like in 5 weeks max. And if we're supposed to take a historical lesson from this, to what extent do we take our current, at any time in history, our current stability and peace for granted? Just how fragile is it? Just how quickly could everything unravel as it unraveled so quickly 100 years ago. The chess piece, the chessboard is not the same as it was 100 years ago. The chess pieces are not in the same place as they were 100 years ago. Um, Frankly, I don't think that we would ever see another world war as we understood World War One and World War Two at the time, because you no longer have a variety of major powers positioned around the world as colonizers. Okay, that's what gave that war its global character. And World War Two was the same thing. So, main, well, if you want to use that acronym, but those are the four causes. Imperialism led to militarism, fueled by nationalism, and in the end made worse by secret alliances. So we were on this slide for a while. That wasn't my intent, but here we go. So here's another map. A map of Europe. Okay, mister, that's a map of Europe. What's the, well, how different is that map from a map of today? If you're familiar with European geography today, it's significantly different. For example, there's a lot less countries. Oh, France is the same and Great Britain is the same, but wait a minute. Okay. Germany, there's a Germany today, much smaller than what you see on that map. Austro-Hungary was an Austria and there's a Hungary, but there's not an Austro-Hungary. And you're right, there was no, there once upon a time there was a country called Austro-Hungary. It was a dual empire of both, you know, a monarch that claimed the throne for both the Austrians and the Hungarians. It was the most interesting one in this entire chess. Other ways to look at this map. Most of Europe is still in the hands of monarchs. If anything, World War I is going to put an end to is the end of absolute or near absolute monarchy in Europe. Russia is a near absolute monarchy. Germany is a near absolute monarchy. The Austrians as well. Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria all had monarchs. There was a king of Italy, a king of Greece. The only country on that map that did not have a king at the time, because the French Revolution, was France. So you still have a year very much, either constitutional monarchies or absolute monarchies, very much still in the hands of monarchs. World War I is going to put an end to that. And every one of those countries you see on the map, with some exceptions, Austria, for example, and Russia, had colonies around the world. Colonies that were feeding resources into each of these countries and played a huge role in helping these countries grow wealthy and prosperous. You'll notice some borders are different. Like Italy doesn't look like that today. What happened, Mr. Hernandez? And about the color coding. So let's talk about the color coding before we move on. And if you see the legend there on the map, it makes perfect sense. All the countries that you see there in pink, and my image is over the last one that you should pay attention to, which was actually the oldest empire in Europe at the time, the Ottoman Empire, today known as Turkey, right? And the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, Austro-Hungary, and Germany, they formed the Central Powers, okay, the Triple Alliance. What do they have in common? They stretched across Central Europe into the Middle East, and they were all governed by absolute monarchs. Okay, these were some of the last, most conservative remaining states in all of Europe. Okay, green, and Spain sat this one out. Okay, to tell you the truth, ever since Spain lost Cuba in 1898 and the Philippines and Puerto Rico, she was in a downward spiral. Okay. So Spain sits this one out. France, Great Britain, and Russia. Italy, let's talk about Italy in a second. Italy joins what we call the Allied powers, the Triple Entente, but later. Actually, Italy at first starts as a central power nation and then switches over. France, Great Britain, and Russia, those were part of the Triple Entente. France was a republic. Great Britain, a constitutional monarchy. Russia was the odd fit here. It was an absolute monarchy. And that's pretty much before, short of going into issues that we don't need to go into. That Finland used to be part of Russia. Okay, Finland was not independent at the time. Finland used to be part of Russia. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania were part of Russia. There's no Poland there. Poland hadn't existed since the 17th century. The Polish people were there, and they were split between, living in East Germany at the time, or Western Russia, or a little piece of northern Austro-Hungary. So there was a Polish people, but there was no Poland nation state. So, for example, the Poles would be an example of a nationalist people at the time that did not have a nation state. They hadn't had one since the 17th century. They were absorbed by their neighboring countries. And remember, Germany and Italy are some of the newest countries on this map right here. Germany only came into existence in 1871. I think Italy came into existence in the 1880s. These were roughly rather new countries. Okay. So we're going to go through a sequence of events and keep your eye on the map. This is the part that everybody is like finds very shocking. So it's 1914. It's the summer of 1914. No big deal. Okay, so let's. I told you all of those countries are also very homogeneous. They're all very homogeneous. Some more than others. I mean, the Germanic states came together to form the German Empire. Are there different dialects within Germany? Sure. But there's more that binds them together than not. The Italians, the northern Italians and the southern Italians, same thing. But I mean, the most diverse nation state, if you even call it that, in all of Central Europe, if not Europe at the time, was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That was a truly multilingual, multinational, multicultural empire trying to hold it together. Had nothing overseas, had no empires over it, didn't need to. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Balkans was, their place to expand into. The Balkans is all those countries to the southeast of, you see the Serbias and Montenegros and Albanias and Romanias and Bulgarias, and the struggle between the Turks and the Austrians that there had been for since the 1500s. But if you look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was basically a patchwork. It was crazy to keep together. You had Italians, Italian speakers, but that fell inside the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austrian rule. So, mister, what are Germans doing that? That's an ethnic designation. Okay, so fun fact, guys. Austrians are ethnically Germans. Ostreich mean basically Southern Germans. Okay, they're ethnically the same people. You had Czechs, Poles. Those are that piece of Polish people, a little bit of ethnic Poles that lived within the Austrian borders, Austro-Hungarian borders. Slovaks, Hungarians, the second largest ethnic group. Romanians, you had Romanians living inside Austria-Hungary, and then you had Romanians living in Romania. Ruthenians, and then when you get to the south, it gets tricky. You have Slovenes and Croats, Serbs. It gets tricky here, okay? These are all people that would also refer to them as Yugoslavs. That means Southern Slavs. And that's another, I guess, identity that we need to discuss because it plays a role here. There are national identities, okay? French, Spanish, German, whatnot. But then there's also transnational identities, identities that transcend particular nation states, like Arabs, for example. I mean, the Arabs are not contained to one nation state. They're or a more contemporary ones, Latins or Latin Americans. They're not. It's an identity. Kind of hard to put your fingers on, but it transcends various nation states. And Slavic. Okay. And if I were to ask in class, is there a country that you could identify, point to as, that this is the home of the Slavic people for the most part? It's Russia. The Belarusians, Ukrainians, even Poles are Slavic people. The Poles being the exception. I mean, most Slavic people are Eastern Orthodox. But then you go down to Yugoslavia. These countries down there consider themselves Southern Slavs as well, and there's an affinity. It's been debated by some historians, but there is a cultural, ethnic, historical, very, very old connection between, the Southern Slavs of the Adriatic Sea and the more northern Slavs of Russia herself and Ukraine. That plays a role as things unfold. Okay, so we're setting the stage for the conflict to come. Here's a map of Europe. For some time, there's a lot of tension and conflict between the Austrians and the Turks over the Balkan states, who gets what, who dominates who. In 1908, Austria, two things happened. Bulgaria was given its independence, but then the Austrians went ahead and unilaterally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, okay, which the people that live there are Serbians, by the way. No, they're Bosnians. Annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina without taking into consideration whether the people there wanted to be annexed to Austria or not, and Austria claimed it was a preventive measure to keep them from being eventually annexed by the Turks instead. So this is going to set the stage for a good number of years of conflict between the local inhabitants of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the ones that were annexed and now are subjects of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and across the border, the Serbs, who are not really big fans of Austria just coming in and unilaterally annexing a big chunk of land and bringing it into Austria, in which the people there are ethnically Serb. So here's where this where Serbian nationalism comes into. The idea that all Serbs have something in common and that Serbs should live together under a common government and common borders. And Austria has kind of upset this sense of Serbian nationalism. So there is going to be efforts to undermine Austria's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Okay, an underground movement, if you will, of Serbian nationalists that seek to undo the annexations of 1908. So if Europe was a powder keg, and well, where's the conflict going to happen? I mean, it could have been anybody's guess. It could be, it happens in the most unusual and unexpected of places. In Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which again I told you the inhabitants were Serbians that had been annexed to Austria in 1908. Now, the Austrian monarchy was a very conservative monarchy, not one very willing to negotiate or even consider nationalist aspirations of a region that had just been annexed years earlier. Um, there were others in the family that were slated to eventually ascend to the throne once the emperor passed away. One of these was the Archduke. The Austrians, every country that they designate titles like Crown Prince. Well, the Archduke for the Austrians, that was the title of the next in line. Okay, who was a nephew, by the way. Apparently, he never had any sons, so the next male relative was his nephew. Maybe you've heard the name before, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And Franz Ferdinand kind of had a crazy idea that the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina that are still not happy about being annexed will come around if he just went and got to know them and let them get to know him and goodwill visit, and maybe they come around to the idea that they're better off under Austrian rule than part of an independent Serbia. And he was warned not to do this. Don't do this. Listen, they don't like you. They don't like us. They're still upset about the annexation. If you go there, there's been, chatter here and there about, a willingness to take your life. Oh, nonsense. We're going to go anyway. So on June 28th, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife and an entourage of officials from the Austrian government made the fateful decision to go and visit the city of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, in a gesture of goodwill to win over the hearts and minds of the Serbian people. Well, any of you that know anything about World War I know that it didn't quite turn out very well. It ended up with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And if I can narrate what you're looking at there in that moving GIF image, it was 6 cars and a motorcade. They showed up in the morning. The plan was they were to drive to City Hall. At City Hall, there was a reception prepared for the Archduke, etc., because of the dignitaries there wanted to put on a good show. So as the 6 cars are driving down the motorcade, on their approach to the City Hall, they were told that there could possibly be individuals there that were planning an assassination. It was a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand, mostly college students. What apparently, I don't see the name of that bridge, but when it approached the City Hall, 3 individuals from that organization ambushed the motorcade and threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, but it missed. It hit the back of the car, it bounced, and it landed under another car and it blew up. A normal person, I guess, after an assassination attempt in which an explosive is thrown at a motorcade and actually succeeds in destroying one of the 6 cars in that motorcade, I mean, you would think, okay, plans are off, let's go back home. No, they decide to continue. And so the 5 remaining cars go to the town hall and they attend the reception. And after the reception, the Archduke says, you know what? I want to go visit the people in the hospital that were wounded during that attack. That seems like a good idea. And so 3 cars leave the town, 2 cars, I think. Well, here's the thing. His chauffeur didn't read Serbian, and all the street signs are in Serbian. I think his chauffeur was Czech. So very easy to get lost. So as you see in that image, 2 cars take off from the town hall towards the hospital. The chauffeur took a wrong turn and stops when he realizes, hey, this isn't the street I'm supposed to come out. And then, you have one of these strange twists of history. There's a right there in that corner, there was a sandwich shop called Schiller's. And out of Schiller's came out Gavrilo Princip, who was one of the individuals in that assassination squad that was meant to kill the Archduke. Now, up to that point, they believed that they had failed in doing so. They threw a bomb, hit the wrong car, killed the wrong people. They failed. So this guy goes and gets a sandwich. And then he's walking out of the sandwich shop. Lo and behold, whose car is right in front of his? Only because the chauffeur took a wrong turn. It's the Archduke. And the guy wastes no time, pulls out his gun, and fires at the Archduke and kills him. And they succeed in assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and they had no idea what this is going to lead to. This assassination of one individual. Needless to say, the Austrians are furious. The Austrians blame the Serbs. The Austrian intelligence claims that they have good information, that there were people in the Serbian government that were behind this, that funneled money and training and preparation for this group of students to carry this off. Because there are people in the Serbian government that would want to reverse that annexation and have Bosnia-Herzegovina returned back to Serbia. Austria issues a 30-day ultimatum. You hand over those individuals in the Serbian government who we believe were complicit in planning out this assassination to be tried on an Austrian court, or we are going to invade Serbia and we're going to annex all of Serbia. Short on details, by the end of those 30 days, and those, why 30 days? Why not just invade immediately? It was 30 days, but it wasn't necessarily an act of generosity. The Austrians were still finishing up their wheat harvest. Okay? And it was going to take 30 days for them to finish harvesting the rest of the wheat for that particular season or year and then mobilize their troops. Okay? So the 30 days was like, okay, we're not going to make a move on you for 30 days because we still need have a lot of wheat to harvest before we go to war. But after those 30 days, you're done. So we're giving you 30 days to, figure things out. And at the end of those 30 days, despite the Serbs meeting most of the conditions, the Serbians went ahead with it anyway. And now, I mean, the Austro-Hungarians went ahead with it and began to mobilize their forces for an invasion and annexation of Serbia. This is their miscalculation. Remember, I told you the Serbs are Yugoslavs, they're Southern Slavs. And so what other country do you suppose would feel a certain affinity, a closeness, maybe even a obligation to defend a smaller, defenseless Slavic nation? And if you guessed it was Russia, you're correct. A lot of people blame Russia for starting because even though what Austria issued was a threat, okay, it was actually Russia that began to mobilize her troops and march those troops towards the Austrian border. This is the same Russia that just a number of years earlier lost the war against Japan. The Tsar of Russia still feels that he needs to live up to his father's legacy. There's a lot of doubts. He lost the war against the Japanese, so that doesn't look good on him. Maybe he could make up for it. The Russians have a huge army, but the Russians are so behind the rest of Europe and so many other things. On top of the fact of having a country mostly of illiterate peasants, but there was a lot of illiterate peasants throughout all of Europe at this time. So the Russians are the actual ones that began to actually, move beyond words and begin to mobilize troops and march them in the direction of the Austrians. And the Austrians are going to go ahead and invade Serbia on July 28th. And there's a long story, long stupid story about the king of Serbia thinking that the Austrians are going to come and slaughter all the children. So he has the children evacuated, has the army escort the children south to evacuate the children. And most of those kids die. Most of those kids die just trying to cross the mountains. And the people he leaves behind to actually defend the country are like middle-aged men, dads, and grandfathers. But anyway, there's there's a lot of bad, crazy decisions that occurred in the summer of 1914. So, Russian miscalculation. Remember how I told you how the Austrians were technically Germans? They were Southern Germans. If Russia feels compelled to come to the aid of Serbia, because Serbia is also a Slavic nation, if Austria is going to feel threatened, who do you think is going to feel compelled to come to the assistance of Austria? It's the Germans, on top of the fact that they were already had an established defense pact. So the German Empire warns the Russians, hey, you leave the Austrians alone, or you're going to find yourself at war with us. Now, the German miscalculation, and this is 2 days later, July 31st. Just takes a couple of days, August 2nd, in which the Germans learned that the Russians had a defense pact with the French. And the French basically, there's no love lost. Revanchism between the Germans and the French are very, the French are more than willing to seek another opportunity to maybe have some revenge from the last time they lost the war against the Germans in the 1870s, the Franco-Prussian War. And this would be a fantastic opportunity. Remember in the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans actually marched into Paris. Okay. So what a great opportunity for the French to even the score. So the French tell the Germans, hey, we have a pact with the Russians. If you intend on making war with the Russians, then we have no choice. We're going to have to go to war with you. And the Germans say, fine, the next day. But the Germans know that going to war with France is going to bring in Belgium. They cannot go through that French-German border. That French-German border, the Maginot Line, is incredibly fortified, has been since the Franco-Prussian War. The only way for the Germans to march into France is through Belgium. Here's the problem. Belgium has a defense pact with the British. Okay? If you go through Belgium, you're going to bring the British into this war. And the Germans are perfectly fine with this because they have been in this toxic, confrontational relationship with the British for a number of years already. Okay? They've been in this arms race building up their navies. What a great opportunity. And the Germans say, well, we don't care, we're going to march through Belgium. And the British say, okay, then fine, if you march through Belgium, then Great Britain has to honor the pact that it has with the Belgians. It has to come to her defense. And so that's going to be on you. Notice how the battle lines are forming. Okay, the Western Front and the Eastern Front. That's just a part of this. The Austrians on August 6th, if the Germans are sticking out their necks for them, the Austrians have to do the same thing. So the Austrians go ahead and declare war against the Russians and the French and the British, August 6th. Okay. So the Archduke gets killed in late June. By late July, the Austrians are invading Serbia. And within a week, the battle lines are already formed throughout Europe. Russia's at war with the Germans and the Austrians, and on the Western Front, the French and the British are at war with the Germans and the Austrians. Doesn't end there. There's more. By October, the Germans were able to convince the Turks to come into the war, to launch a surprise attack across the Black Sea at the Russians, which, of course, there was no love lost. There had been conflicts in the past between the Turks and the Russians. Excuse me. And so that's going to bring the Ottomans into this, and it's, you have to understand why. Once Germany and Great Britain go to war, Great Britain has a much larger surface navy than the Germans do. And the first thing that's going to come into play is a blockade. A blockade of the North Sea and the English Channel, meaning Germany's going to have a really tough time getting anything in and out of its coastline, on top of the fact that in the winter it freezes over. Hence the need to bring the Turks into this war. If the British successfully blockade the Germans from reaching out to the outside world, if the Germans and the Austrians could bring the Turks on board, at the very least they could have a overland supply corridor that goes through Turkey, Bulgaria. Bulgaria joined in because she was caught in the middle. Goes through Turkey, Bulgaria, Austria, and Germany, despite a blockade in the North Sea. Okay? So Germany needs to maintain supply lines coming in from the outside world, and Turkey is the necessary partner to make this happen. Germany pledges to support Turkey if Turkey could pull that off.